There is a story no one tells you when you are young, a story about the strange gravity of pain, about how some wounds, instead of healing, become altars, how suffering, rather than something we escape, becomes something we worship. Picture this. A woman sits alone in her apartment at 3 in the morning. The phone glows in her hand. She scrolls through messages from a man who has hurt her 7 times. 7 times she has said never again. 7 times she has returned. Her friends call it weakness. Her therapist calls it trauma bonding. But neither of them understand the deeper truth, that she is not simply trapped in a pattern. She is in love with it. She is devoted to it. The wound has become her identity, her purpose, her strange and terrible home. This is not a story about one woman. This is a story about all of us, about the hidden architecture of the human psyche, about why we return again and again to the very things that destroy us, about why healing feels like betrayal, about why we resist the light and cling to the familiar darkness. Tonight, we descend into one of the most disturbing and beautiful mysteries of human consciousness. Why do we fall in love with our own wounds? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally, with all the obsession, devotion, and protective rage of romantic love. Why does the abused child grow up to choose abusive partners? Why does the neglected soul seek out neglect? Why does suffering feel safer than joy? Why does transformation terrify us more than staying broken? These are not rhetorical questions. They are portals into the shadow dimension of the psyche, the place where consciousness meets its own darkness, where we discover that we are not simply victims of our past, but its most faithful custodians. Before we begin this journey, I must warn you, what we will discover tonight is not comfortable. It will challenge your assumptions about healing, growth, and human nature itself. You may see yourself in ways you have never wished to see. You may recognize patterns you have spent years denying. This is the descent Carl Jung spoke of, the necessary journey into the underworld of the self. But I promise you this, on the other side of this darkness lies something luminous, an understanding so profound it changes not just how you see yourself, but how you see all of human suffering, how you see love, how you see consciousness itself. So let us begin where all great psychological mysteries begin, not with answers, but with a single haunting question. What if your suffering is not an accident? What if, at some deep and unconscious level, you have chosen it? What if you are keeping your wound alive because, without it, you do not know who you are? The ancient Greeks had a word for this phenomenon, though they did not fully understand it. They called it pathos, suffering that carries meaning, pain that becomes identity. The early Christians took this further, transforming suffering into a virtue, a path to the divine. Martyrdom became holy. Pain became proof of devotion. But it was not until the birth of depth psychology, not until we learned to listen to the whispers of the unconscious mind, that we began to understand the terrible truth. We do not simply endure suffering. We cultivate it, we protect it, we make it sacred. Sigmund Freud stumbled upon this mystery in 1914 while treating shell-shocked soldiers returning from the Great War. These men, traumatized beyond measure, did something that baffled him. They returned to their trauma in dreams, in flashbacks, in compulsive reenactments. They could not let it go. They circled it like moths around a flame. Freud called this repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate traumatic experiences. But he could not explain why. Why would the psyche, whose primary drive is pleasure, whose deepest instinct is survival, willingly return to pain? His answer, developed over years of clinical observation, was radical. There exists within us a force more powerful than the pleasure principle. He called it the death drive, thanatos, a fundamental impulse toward destruction, toward the dissolution of the self, toward returning to an inorganic state, a psychological gravity that pulls us back toward nothingness. But Freud's student and eventual rival, Carl Jung, saw something different in this compulsion. He saw not a death wish, but a search for meaning. He saw the psyche's desperate attempt to integrate what has been split off, to heal what has been broken, to make whole what has been fragmented. And here, in this difference of interpretation, lies the key to our mystery. What if we return to our wounds not because we wish to die, but because we wish to be reborn? What if repetition is not compulsion, but ritual? What if the psyche is trying to tell us something, and we keep missing the message? Consider the etymology of the word wound. It comes from the Old English wund, meaning an injury to the body. But trace it back further to its Proto-Indo-European root, wen, and you discover something startling. It shares a root with win, to desire, to strive for, to love, a wound, a win, a desire. The language itself remembers what we have forgotten, that our wounds and our longings are intimately connected, that what hurts us and what we seek are somehow the same thing. This is not an accident of linguistics. This is a map of consciousness itself. Every human being carries within them what Jung called the shadow, the rejected, repressed, denied aspects of the self, the parts of us we deemed unacceptable, unlovable, dangerous. These parts do not disappear when we banish them. They do not dissolve into the unconscious and fade away. Instead, they grow stronger in the darkness. They take on a life of their own. They become autonomous complexes, psychological entities with their own agendas, their own intelligence, their own power. And these shadow aspects, these disowned parts of ourselves, they speak to us through symptoms, through repetitive patterns, through the wounds we cannot heal. The woman who returns to the emotionally unavailable man is not simply repeating trauma. She is trying to redeem the original wound, the unavailable father, the absent mother. She is trying to win the love that was never given. She is trying to prove that she is worthy, that she is enough, that she can transform neglect into devotion. But here is the terrible irony. The more she tries, the more she reinforces the original belief, that she is not worthy, that she must earn love, that she is fundamentally insufficient. This is the tragedy of the wounded psyche. Our attempts to heal often deepen the wound, and yet we cannot stop. We are driven by something more powerful than reason, more ancient than consciousness itself. We are driven by the soul's insistence that no part of us can be left behind, that everything rejected must be reclaimed, that every wound must be witnessed. The question is not why we fall in love with our wounds. The question is, what are our wounds trying to teach us? Tonight, we will follow this question into the labyrinth. We will trace the origins of psychological wounding. We will explore the mechanisms by which pain becomes identity. We will descend into the shadow realm where suffering transforms into meaning. And we will discover, perhaps, why the journey through darkness is the only path to genuine transformation. This is not a story about victimhood. This is a story about the strange alchemy of consciousness, how lead becomes gold, how pain becomes wisdom, how the wound becomes the bow that shoots the arrow of awakening. Are you ready? Then let us descend. In the beginning, there is no wound. There is only openness, pure, undifferentiated consciousness. The infant emerges into the world as raw potential, a field of infinite possibility, no shame, no fear, no sense of separation between self and other, between inner and outer, between what is acceptable and what must be hidden. This is what the mystics call original innocence, what psychologists call primary narcissism, what poets call Eden. But Eden cannot last. The world intrudes, needs go unmet. Love comes with conditions. The infinite must squeeze itself into the finite. The eternal must accept the limitations of time, of body, of circumstance. And in this necessary compression, in this forced descent from unity into separation, the first wound is born. The British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called this the original trauma, not a single catastrophic event, but the inevitable disappointment of perfect union. The moment the infant realizes that the mother is separate, that comfort does not always come, that the universe is not responsive to every need. This is not the mother's failure. This is the human condition. This is the price of individuation, of becoming a separate self. But the infant psyche does not understand this existential reality. The infant only knows, something is wrong, something is missing, I am not whole. And so begins the fundamental project of childhood, the construction of a self that can survive in a world that does not automatically provide, the development of strategies to get needs met, the formation of what psychologists call attachment patterns. Secure attachment. When I cry, comfort comes. The world is safe. I am worthy of love. Anxious attachment. Comfort is unpredictable. I must monitor constantly. I must prove my worthiness. Avoidant attachment. Comfort is dangerous. It leads to disappointment. I must be self-sufficient. Disorganized attachment. Comfort and fear come from the same source. The world is chaos. I am chaos. These patterns, formed in the first 3 years of life, become the templates through which we perceive all future relationships. They are not memories we can recall. They are structures deeper than memory, inscribed in the neurobiology of the developing brain, encoded in the implicit procedural systems that guide behavior before thought. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio calls these somatic markers, emotional signatures attached to experiences that guide decision-making below the threshold of consciousness. We move toward or away from situations not because we have rationally assessed them, but because they carry the feeling tone of past experiences. And here is where the mystery deepens. The child who experiences neglect does not simply learn, I am unworthy of attention. The child also learns, this feeling, this ache of being unseen, this is what love feels like. The nervous system cannot distinguish between what we desire and what we are familiar with. Familiarity becomes safety, and safety, even when it hurts, becomes home. Let me tell you a story that illuminates this principle. In the 1950s, psychologist Harry Harlow conducted a series of experiments that would forever change our understanding of attachment. He separated infant rhesus monkeys from their mothers and offered them a choice between 2 surrogate mothers, one made of wire that provided food and one covered in soft cloth that provided no sustenance. Logic would predict that the infants would prefer the wire mother, the source of nourishment, of survival itself, but they did not. They clung to the cloth mother, visiting the wire mother only when desperately hungry, then immediately returning to the soft embrace of cloth. Harlow concluded that contact comfort was more fundamental than food, that the need for connection supersedes the need for physical sustenance. But later research revealed something more disturbing. When Harlow introduced a modification, making the cloth mother periodically blast the infant with compressed air or shake violently, the infants did not flee. Instead, they clung tighter. The abuse increased attachment. This finding, so counterintuitive to rational thought, reveals a fundamental principle of mammalian bonding. Under threat, we seek proximity to our attachment figure, even if that figure is the source of the threat. In the wild, this makes evolutionary sense. A young primate separated from its mother has 0 chance of survival. Any mother, even an abusive one, is better than no mother. So the nervous system is wired to maintain attachment at all costs. But in humans, this same mechanism creates a terrible vulnerability. We bond to what harms us. We attach to pain. We confuse fear with love. The child who is beaten learns, I am worthy of violence, but also, this violence means I matter. This attention, even when it hurts, means I exist. The child who is ignored learns, I am invisible, but also, this emptiness is what relationships feel like. This is normal. The child who is praised only for achievement learns, love is conditional, but also, my worth is measured by performance. Rest is dangerous. Failure is annihilation. These lessons are not conscious. They are not beliefs we can challenge with logic. They are imprints. neurobiological grooves along which energy flows automatically, unconsciously, compulsively, and they determine everything. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's foremost experts on trauma, writes in his book, "The Body Keeps the Score." The greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves. But he also acknowledges a deeper truth. These lies are not cognitive, they are somatic. They live in the body, in the autonomic nervous system, in the amygdala's assessment of threat, in the vagus nerve's regulation of social engagement. You cannot think your way out of trauma. You cannot reason yourself into a new attachment pattern, because the wound exists below the level of thought, in the pre-verbal, implicit, embodied realm of experience. And this is why insight alone never heals. This is why understanding our patterns does not automatically change them. This is why we can know intellectually that we deserve better, that we should leave, that we are repeating history, and still we stay. Still we return. Still we choose the familiar pain over the unknown possibility of joy. Because healing requires more than understanding. It requires dissent. It requires meeting the wound in its own territory, speaking its language, honoring its intelligence. But before we can do that, we must understand how wounds become identity, how suffering transforms from an experience we have into a definition of who we are. The process unfolds in stages. Stage 1, the original injury. Something happens, a betrayal, an abandonment, a violation, a loss. The psyche, overwhelmed, unable to integrate the experience, fragments. Parts of the self are split off, exiled to the unconscious. We learn in that moment, this is not safe. This must never happen again. Stage 2, the defensive strategy. The psyche, attempting to prevent future injury, constructs defenses. We become hypervigilant. We scan for danger. We modify our behavior to avoid triggering others. We make ourselves small, or loud, or invisible, or indispensable. Whatever strategy seemed to minimize pain becomes the template. These defenses work. They protect us. They allow us to survive. But they also imprison us. Because once established, they resist change. They become rigid. They generalize. Soon we are defending against threats that do not exist, living in a world constructed by past trauma rather than present reality. Stage 3, identity formation. Now comes the crucial shift. The defensive strategy stops being something we do and becomes who we are. I am someone who has been hurt. I am someone who cannot trust. I am someone who is too much, not enough. I am someone who must always be strong. I am someone who will always be alone. The wound becomes the core of identity. The thing that makes us special, gives us depth, explains our suffering. It becomes our story, our mythology, our excuse, and our prison. And here is where the falling in love begins. Because if I am my wound, then healing means death. If my identity is constructed around suffering, then joy is a threat to my existence. If my sense of self is built on being broken, then wholeness is annihilation. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche saw this dynamic clearly. He wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." But he also wrote something more disturbing. "What does not kill me makes me stronger." This second statement has been misunderstood, weaponized, turned into a motivational platitude. But Nietzsche was not celebrating trauma. He was describing a transformation, the way suffering, when survived, becomes a source of identity and power. The survivor's pride, the wounded healer's authority, the artist's romantic suffering, the revolutionary's righteous anger. These are not weaknesses. These are genuine sources of meaning, purpose, and power. But they come with a cost. We become invested in remaining wounded. The survivor who heals loses their identity as a survivor. The wounded healer who becomes whole loses their connection to the wounded. The artist who finds peace loses their source of creative anguish. The revolutionary who achieves justice loses their enemy. And so, unconsciously, we sabotage our own healing. We pick at scabs. We seek out situations that confirm our wounds. We reject love because it does not match our inner template of what love should feel like, which is to say, it does not hurt in the familiar way. Jung understood this better than anyone. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." But he also understood why. Facing the soul means facing the shadow. And the shadow contains everything we have rejected about ourselves, including the possibility that we are not simply victims of our wounds, but their co-creators. That we are not merely suffering from the past, but actively maintaining it in the present. This is the most difficult truth in all of psychology. We are complicit in our own suffering, not responsible in the sense of blame, not guilty in the sense of moral failing, but complicit in the sense of participation. Unconscious participation, yes, but participation nonetheless. The woman who chooses emotionally unavailable men is not consciously deciding, "I will recreate the abandonment of my childhood." She is following the compass of the nervous system, which has learned this feeling of longing, of almost but not quite having. This is what love is. Anything else feels wrong, unfamiliar, dangerous. The man who sabotages every moment of success is not consciously thinking, "I will destroy this opportunity." He is enacting a script written in childhood. Success means losing connection. Achievement means isolation. Better to fail and remain part of the tribe than succeed and be exiled. These are not pathologies. These are adaptations. Intelligent responses to impossible situations. The psyche doing the best it can with the information it has. But they are also prisons. And the key to the prison is hidden in the wound itself. The Greek myth of Philoctetes illuminates this mystery perfectly. Philoctetes was a great archer, friend to Hercules, warrior of Troy, but on the journey to war he was bitten by a snake. The wound festered, became infected, emanated a terrible smell. His companions, unable to bear the stench, abandoned him on the island of Lemnos. For 10 years, Philoctetes lived alone with his wound, his bow, and his rage. The wound would not heal, the pain would not cease, and his bitterness toward those who abandoned him became his constant companion. But then came a prophecy. Troy could not be conquered without Philoctetes' bow. The Greeks returned to fetch him, and Philoctetes faced a choice: return to those who abandoned him, or remain alone with his wound. The myth ends with Philoctetes healed by the god Asclepius and joining the war. But the deeper meaning is clear. The wound that caused his exile also made him necessary. His suffering became his power. His isolation became his identity. And the question the myth asks is eternal. Can we give up the wound that has defined us? Can we surrender the suffering that has given us meaning? Or will we cling to it, protect it, fall in love with it, because without it, we do not know who we are? We have traced the origins. We have seen how wounds form, how defenses crystallize, how suffering becomes identity. Now we must go deeper. We must descend into the mechanisms by which this love affair with pain perpetuates itself. We must explore the shadow realm where healing becomes betrayal and wholeness becomes threat. There is a patient. Let us call her Sarah. She sits in the therapist's office for the 30th time, describing the same pattern. Another relationship has ended. Another man who seemed different at first, then revealed himself to be exactly like the others, distant, withholding, incapable of the intimacy she craves. The therapist gently suggests a possibility. Sarah, what if this pattern is not random? What if, at some unconscious level, you are choosing these men? Sarah's response is immediate, visceral. How dare you? How dare you suggest I want this? I hate this. I've been trying to change this for years. Why would I choose pain? The therapist nods, familiar with this resistance. She knows that the conscious mind and the unconscious mind often want entirely different things, that what we profess to seek and what we actually move toward can be in direct opposition. I'm not saying you consciously choose pain, the therapist replies. I'm saying there may be an unconscious part of you that finds this familiar pattern safer than the unknown territory of genuine intimacy. Sarah goes silent. Something has been touched, some truth she has felt but never named. This is the conflict at the heart of our exploration tonight. The war between the part of us that wants to heal and the part of us that wants to stay wounded. Between the conscious desire for change and the unconscious commitment to consistency. Between the longing for transformation and the terror of the unknown. This conflict is not metaphorical. It is not a poetic way of describing ambivalence. It is a genuine neurobiological battle between different systems in the brain, different timescales of learning, different survival strategies encoded at different levels of the nervous system. Let me explain the machinery. The human brain is not one unified system. It is multiple systems, evolved at different times, operating on different principles, often in conflict with one another. At the base we have the reptilian brain, the brainstem and cerebellum, responsible for basic survival functions, breathing, heart rate, fight, flight, freeze responses. This system operates on instinct, on immediate sensory input, on binary assessments, safe or dangerous, approach or avoid. Above that, we have the mammalian brain, the limbic system, responsible for emotion, memory, attachment, social bonding. This is where the amygdala constantly scans for threat, where the hippocampus encodes experiences into long-term memory, where the basal ganglia create habit patterns. And finally, we have the primate brain, the neocortex, responsible for reasoning, planning, language, abstract thought, self-reflection. This is the part of us that can imagine different futures, that can override instinct, that can choose consciously rather than react automatically. These three brains, reptilian, mammalian, cortical, are in constant dialogue, but they do not speak the same language. They do not operate on the same timescale. And when there is conflict between them, the lower systems usually win, because survival trumps everything. And here is the crucial insight. The reptilian and mammalian brains do not distinguish between physical survival and psychological survival. To these ancient systems, social rejection feels like death. Abandonment triggers the same alarm as a predator. The loss of attachment activates the same panic as starvation. So when the child experiences abandonment, neglect, abuse, or betrayal, these lower brain systems encode the experience as a survival threat, and they develop strategies to prevent it from happening again. These strategies are not rational, they are not chosen. They are automatic, embodied, preconscious responses, and once encoded, they are extremely resistant to change. The neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux discovered something remarkable about the amygdala, the brain's fear center. He found that the amygdala can be conditioned to associate a neutral stimulus with danger in a single trial. One traumatic experience is enough to create a lasting fear response. But here is the key finding. While the amygdala can quickly learn fear, it cannot quickly unlearn it. Even when the threat no longer exists, even when the neocortex knows rationally that the danger has passed, the amygdala continues to sound the alarm. This is why trauma is so persistent. This is why past experiences continue to shape present responses long after they are relevant. The emotional brain operates on the principle, better safe than sorry. Better to see threat where none exists than to miss a threat that does. This is adaptive in a genuinely dangerous environment, but it becomes a prison when applied universally, when every intimate situation triggers the alarm, when trust becomes impossible, when love registers as danger. And this is the first mechanism by which we fall in love with our wounds. The nervous system has learned that the wound is what kept us safe, that hypervigilance protected us, that emotional distance prevented betrayal, that self-sufficiency avoided disappointment. The wound is not the problem. The wound is the solution. Or so the nervous system believes. But the machinery goes deeper still. In the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted experiments that revealed another crucial mechanism. He placed dogs in cages where they would receive random electric shocks. At first, the dogs tried to escape. They jumped, scratched, fought against their restraints. But after repeated failures to escape, something changed. The dogs stopped trying. Even when the cage door was later opened, even when escape became possible, the dogs remained passive. They had learned helplessness. Seligman extended this research to humans and found the same pattern. People who experience repeated uncontrollable negative events develop a cognitive and emotional shutdown. They stop believing in their own agency. They stop trying to change their circumstances. They accept suffering as inevitable. This phenomenon illuminates a second mechanism. Learned helplessness creates an identity of powerlessness, and this identity, paradoxically, provides a sense of control. If I am helpless, then I am not responsible for my suffering. If my wound is outside my control, then I need not face the terrifying possibility that I could choose differently, that I have always been able to choose differently. The German psychologist Erich Fromm called this the fear of freedom. He observed that many people prefer the security of unfreedom, the predictability of their chains, to the responsibility of liberation. Because freedom is terrifying, freedom means authorship. It means acknowledging that our lives are not simply happening to us, but are being created by us moment by moment, choice by choice. And this acknowledgement requires confronting a devastating question. If I have the power to choose, why have I chosen this? Why have I stayed? Why have I returned? The wound becomes a refuge from this question. The identity of victim becomes a shield against accountability, not legal or moral accountability, but existential accountability, the responsibility for what we make of what has been made of us. Viktor Frankl, survivor of Auschwitz, understood this distinction profoundly. He wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But he also observed something darker. Many prisoners, when liberated, struggled to adjust to freedom. They had become so adapted to captivity, so identified with suffering, that freedom felt like a kind of death. This is the paradox of the wound. It hurts us, but it also defines us. It limits us, but it also protects us from the vastness of possibility. It makes us special, tragic, deep, interesting. It gives us a story to tell, a reason for our failures, an excuse for our limitations. And so we protect it, we worship it, we fall in love with it. Let me illustrate this with a clinical case that haunts me still. A man, we'll call him David, came to therapy with severe depression. His childhood had been marked by extreme emotional neglect. His mother, severely depressed herself, had been physically present but emotionally absent. His father, a workaholic, was rarely home. David grew up feeling invisible, and this invisibility became his organizing principle. He chose careers where he worked behind the scenes. He pursued relationships with women who were self-absorbed. He structured his life to ensure he would never be truly seen. In therapy, as he began to understand this pattern, something unexpected happened. As he started to become more visible, speaking up at work, setting boundaries in relationships, allowing himself to be known, he became increasingly anxious. He experienced panic attacks. He began to sabotage the therapy. One session, he explained why. If people actually see me, they will realize I'm empty. The invisibility isn't the wound, it's the protection. Without it, I'm exposed, I'm vulnerable, I'm nothing. This moment of truth revealed the deepest level of the machinery. The wound is not just a symptom. It is a structure. It is the architecture of the self. And dismantling it feels like self-annihilation. Because the question beneath all psychological suffering is not, how do I stop hurting? The question is, who am I without my pain? And for many of us, the answer is, I don't know. And that not knowing is more terrifying than the familiar suffering. The existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the act of lying to ourselves about our own freedom, of pretending we have no choice in order to avoid the anxiety of choice. But the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan went further. He argued that the ego itself is a defensive structure, a fiction we construct to avoid confronting the fundamental lack at the core of human existence. We are not born with a unified self. We construct one through identification, through narrative, through the internalization of others' perceptions. And for many of us, that constructed self is built around the wound. The wound gives us coherence. It explains our behavior. It provides continuity across time. It makes sense of our past and justifies our present and excuses our future. I am broken is still an identity. And identity, even a painful one, is preferable to the void of non-identity. This is why spiritual teachers throughout history have spoken of ego death as necessary for awakening. This is why the mystics insist we must die before we die, because genuine transformation requires the dissolution of the familiar self, including the wounded self. But the ego will not go quietly. It will fight for its existence. It will use every defense mechanism available: denial, rationalization, projection, displacement, intellectualization, sublimation. And its most powerful defense is this: it will make the wound sacred. The psychologist James Hillman wrote about the soul's code, the idea that our wounds are not accidents but callings, that our suffering carries a message, that our pain is purposeful. This is a beautiful idea, and there is truth in it. Our wounds do carry intelligence. They do point towards something deeper. They are calls to awakening. But this idea can also become a trap. It can transform suffering into a spiritual commodity. It can make us believe that our pain is special, chosen, meaningful in a way that joy could never be. This is what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned against when he criticized slave morality, the tendency to make virtues out of necessities, to elevate suffering to a spiritual achievement, to believe that pain brings us closer to truth or divinity or authentic being. In Christianity, this became the glorification of martyrdom. In Buddhism, it can become attachment to detachment, clinging to non-clinging. In modern psychology, it becomes the romance of the wounded healer, the belief that only those who have suffered deeply can understand or help others. And while there is experiential wisdom in surviving hardship, there is also danger in making suffering a prerequisite for value, because this belief creates a perverse incentive. To remain valuable, we must remain wounded. The therapist who has healed completely might feel they have lost their connection to suffering, their empathy for the struggling. The artist who has found peace might fear they have lost their edge, their depth, their ability to create meaningful work. The activist who has achieved justice might feel they have lost their purpose, their identity, their reason for being. And so unconsciously, we seek out new wounds, we create new enemies, we find new reasons to suffer. This is not conscious hypocrisy. This is the unconscious machinery of identity maintenance. The psyche, attempting to preserve continuity of self, will sacrifice growth, will resist change, will return to the familiar, even when the familiar is killing us. The psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion called this a tax on linking, the way the mind sabotages its own attempts to make connections, to integrate experience, to develop new understanding. Because new understanding means change, and change means death of the old self. So we forget insights, we reject interpretations, we intellectualize rather than feel. We understand without transforming. This is why insight is not enough, why analysis without emotional experience is impotent, why we can spend years in therapy understanding our patterns without changing them, because understanding happens in the neocortex. But the wound lives in the body, in the limbic system, in the implicit memory systems that operate below conscious awareness. To truly heal, we must meet the wound where it lives. We must descend below thought, below language, below the rational mind's attempts to solve, fix, or transcend. We must enter what Jung called the dark night of the soul, the period of psychological death that precedes rebirth. And this is terrifying, because descent means surrender. It means giving up the illusion of control. It means acknowledging that we cannot think our way out, cannot will ourselves into wholeness, cannot bypass the pain. It means, paradoxically, embracing the wound fully before we can release it, loving it before we can let it go. Because what we resist persists. What we fight against, we energize. What we try to transcend prematurely, we merely repress. The path to healing is not over the wound, it is through it. But before we can make that journey, we must understand one more mechanism, perhaps the most insidious of all, the way our wounds organize our perception of reality itself. The psychologist Aaron Beck, founder of cognitive therapy, discovered that depression is maintained by what he called cognitive distortions, systematic errors in thinking that reinforce negative beliefs. Black and white thinking, catastrophizing, personalization, mind reading, discounting the positive. These distortions are not random. They are selective attention mechanisms that filter reality to confirm our core beliefs about ourselves. If I believe I am unworthy of love, I will notice every instance of rejection and dismiss every instance of acceptance. If I believe I am fundamentally flawed, I will focus on my mistakes and ignore my successes. If I believe relationships are dangerous, I will see threat in intimacy and safety in distance. The wound creates a lens through which we view the world, and that lens confirms the wound's validity. This is called confirmation bias in cognitive psychology. But it is deeper than bias. It is the construction of reality itself. The neuroscientist Anil Seth argues that perception is not passive reception of objective reality, but active construction based on prior expectations. The brain is a prediction machine, constantly generating models of the world and testing them against sensory input, and those models are built from experience, especially early, intense, emotionally charged experience. So the child who learns I am unwanted develops a perceptual model that predicts and looks for evidence of being unwanted. The nervous system becomes exquisitely attuned to signs of rejection, while remaining relatively blind to signs of acceptance. This is not pessimism. This is not negative thinking. This is the way the brain constructs reality based on past experience, and once constructed, this reality becomes self-fulfilling. The person who expects rejection behaves in ways that invite it, by being clingy or distant or testing or self-sabotaging. Then, when rejection comes, the wound is confirmed. The belief is validated. The pattern is reinforced. The sociologist Robert Merton called this a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it is more accurate to say our wounds are self-confirming systems, and this is the final mechanism by which we fall in love with our wounds. They create a coherent world, a world that makes sense, a world that is predictable, even when that predictability includes pain. The alternative, to surrender the wound, is to surrender that coherence, to admit that reality is not fixed, that we are not who we thought we were, that everything could be different, and that possibility is more destabilizing than any amount of familiar suffering. So here we are, in the depths of the descent. We have seen the machinery of self-sabotage, the neurobiological imperatives, the psychological defenses, the identity structures, the perceptual filters, all working together to maintain the wound, to protect it, to keep it alive. And we have seen why. Because the wound is not simply pain. It is meaning, identity, coherence, protection, and purpose. To release it is to release everything it has provided. To let it go is to step into the void of not knowing. This is the conflict. This is the war within. This is why change is so difficult, why healing is so slow, why we resist what we claim to want. But now, having descended into the darkness, having faced the mechanisms that bind us to suffering, we can ask the essential question: is there a way through? Is transformation possible? Can we release the wound without losing ourselves? Can we heal without betraying the part of us that found safety in the familiar pain? The answer is yes. But the path is not what you might expect. There is a moment in every genuine healing process when something shifts. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself, but it is unmistakable. It is the moment when resistance softens, when the fierce protection of the wound relaxes just slightly, when the question changes from "how do I get rid of this?" to "what is this trying to tell me?" This is the beginning of transformation, not healing through elimination, but healing through integration, not overcoming the wound, but understanding it so deeply that it transforms from enemy into teacher. Let me take you back to Sarah, the woman we met earlier, who kept choosing emotionally unavailable partners. After months of therapy, she had intellectually understood her pattern. She could articulate how her distant father created a template of love as longing, how she sought unavailable men to recreate and hopefully resolve that original wound. She understood it perfectly, but understanding had changed nothing. She still felt drawn to the same type of man, still felt a hollow boredom with men who were actually available, who showed up, who wanted intimacy. Then one night, lying awake after another disappointing date with a kind, available man she felt nothing for, she stopped fighting. She stopped trying to force herself to feel what she thought she should feel. She stopped judging herself for her attractions. Instead, she asked a different question. What does this longing protect me from? And in that moment of genuine inquiry, an answer arose from somewhere deeper than thought. It protects me from being known. If I'm always longing for someone who isn't available, I never have to risk being seen. I never have to find out if the real me is worthy of love. The unavailable man is not the wound, he's the shield. This was not intellectual understanding. This was embodied knowing. She felt it in her chest, in her throat, in the tears that came unbidden. The wound had spoken its truth, and in that speaking, its grip loosened. This is the first principle of transformation. The wound must be witnessed, not solved. The psychiatrist Dan Siegel speaks of name it to tame it, the way simply naming and acknowledging emotional experience activates the prefrontal cortex and reduces amygdala activation. Putting feelings into words literally calms the nervous system, but it is more than neurological regulation. It is the act of bringing unconscious material into consciousness, of making the implicit explicit, of giving voice to what has been mute. Jung called this process integration of the shadow. The shadow, all the rejected, repressed, disowned parts of ourselves, does not want to be destroyed. It wants to be recognized. It wants to be included in the wholeness of who we are. When we fight the shadow, it grows stronger. When we judge it, it goes deeper into hiding. But when we acknowledge it, when we say, I see you, I understand why you're here, I know you're trying to protect me, it relaxes, it softens, it becomes available for transformation. This is counterintuitive to our therapeutic culture's emphasis on fixing and overcoming and conquering our wounds. But those military metaphors reveal a fundamental misunderstanding. We cannot win a war against ourselves. Every part of the psyche, even the parts that seem destructive, has a positive intention. Every defense mechanism, every symptom, every self-sabotaging pattern is attempting to protect us from something worse. The panic attack is trying to protect us from perceived danger. The depression is trying to slow us down, to force us to rest, to prevent further depletion. The addiction is trying to soothe unbearable emotional pain. The self-harm is trying to externalize and make visible invisible suffering. These strategies may be maladaptive, they may cause more harm than good, but they are intelligent responses to impossible situations. They are the psyche doing the best it can with the resources available. And when we approach them with curiosity rather than condemnation, with compassion rather than control, something miraculous happens. They begin to tell us their stories. They reveal the wounds they are protecting. They show us what we have not been able to see. This is what the therapist and author Tara Brach calls radical acceptance, not approval of harmful behavior, but deep acknowledgement of what is, without the overlay of judgment and shame that prevents genuine understanding. Radical acceptance does not mean resignation. It means making space for reality to be exactly as it is, so that it can show us what it needs to become. But here is the challenge. True acceptance requires descending into the wound, not hovering above it with compassionate platitudes. It requires feeling what we have spent a lifetime avoiding. It requires letting the frozen emotions thaw, letting the memories surface, letting the body release what it has been holding. This is the work of trauma therapy. This is why approaches like EMDR, somatic experiencing, internal family systems, and sensory-motor psychotherapy have become so essential. Because the wound is not a cognitive problem. It is a stuck place in the nervous system. It is incomplete survival energy, the fight, flight, freeze response that was activated but never completed. It is dissociated experience waiting to be reintegrated. Peter Levine, creator of somatic experiencing, observed that animals in the wild regularly experience life-threatening situations but rarely develop PTSD. Why? Because they complete the stress response cycle. They run, they fight, they freeze, and then when safe, they shake, they pant, they discharge the energy. Humans, with our complex brains, often interrupt this natural completion. We go into freeze and stay there. We override our body's wisdom with thoughts about what should be happening. We dissociate to survive overwhelming experience, and then we remain dissociated. Healing means returning to these incomplete experiences, not to re-traumatize, but to complete what was interrupted, to let the body finally do what it needed to do, to say no, to fight back, to escape, to feel what was too dangerous to feel in the original moment. This is delicate work. It cannot be rushed. It must happen at the pace of safety, with the regulation of a trusted other, within the window of tolerance where experience can be metabolized without re-traumatization. But when it happens, when the stuck energy moves, when the frozen emotions thaw, when the body releases, it is like watching ice transform into water, like watching stone become fluid again. This is the second principle of transformation. Healing is not transcendence, it is embodiment. We do not heal by rising above the wound, by spiritually bypassing it, by transcending the body and its messy emotions. We heal by descending into the body, by feeling fully, by allowing the soma to tell its truth. The contemporary trauma therapist Gabor Mate writes, "The question is not why the addiction, but why the pain." But he might equally ask, why has the pain not been allowed to be felt? Because we live in a culture that pathologizes suffering, that medicates discomfort, that demands productivity over presence, that values doing over being. And so we learn early, your pain is not welcome here, your tears are too much, your anger is inappropriate, your grief is inconvenient. We learn to split off from experience, to live in our heads, to analyze rather than feel, to solve rather than surrender. But the body remembers. The body keeps the score, as Van der Kolk reminds us. And until we return to the body, until we listen to its wisdom, the wound remains. This is why mindfulness practices have become central to trauma treatment. Why yoga, dance, martial arts, breathwork, any practice that brings us back into embodied presence, can be profoundly healing. Not because these practices make the wound go away, but because they teach us to be with what is, to feel without being overwhelmed, to notice sensation without immediately needing to change it. This capacity to be present with discomfort is the foundation of all transformation. But there is another dimension to healing that is often overlooked, the wound as portal to the sacred. Jung believed that psychological crisis is often a spiritual crisis in disguise, that the breakdown of the ego is necessary for the breakthrough of the self, the deeper, archetypal dimension of human consciousness that transcends the personal. He noticed that his patients often experienced profound spiritual openings in the midst of their deepest suffering, that their symptoms were not merely problems to be solved, but calls to a larger life, invitations to a deeper conversation with meaning itself. This is the third principle of transformation. The wound is a threshold. In indigenous cultures, the wounded healer is a recognized archetype. The person who has been shattered and put themselves back together carries medicine. They have traveled to the underworld and returned. They can guide others through the darkness because they know the territory. But this is not because their wounding makes them superior. It is because their willingness to descend, to face their shadow, to integrate their pain rather than deny it, has made them whole in a way that innocence never could. The poet Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." This is not romantic nonsense. This is phenomenological truth. When the defenses break down, when the ego structure cracks, when we can no longer maintain the false self, the authentic self can finally emerge. But this emergence is not automatic. It requires what the alchemists called solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. First, the dissolution of the old structure, then the coalescence of the new. And between dissolution and coalescence is the void, the liminal space, the dark night of the soul where we are no longer who we were, but not yet who we are becoming. This is the most dangerous part of the journey. This is where many turn back. Because the void has no landmarks, no guidance, no promise of arrival. It requires trust in a process we cannot see, cannot control, cannot understand. It requires surrender. And surrender is not passive. Surrender is the most active thing we can do. It is the conscious releasing of control, the deliberate opening to what wants to emerge, the courageous willingness to not know. The mystic Meister Eckhart called this letting go and letting God. But you need not be religious to understand the principle. There is an intelligence larger than the ego's will, a wisdom deeper than conscious intention, a movement of life that knows where it is going even when we do not. Trusting that intelligence requires faith, not faith in a belief system, but faith in the process itself, faith that the psyche knows what it is doing, that the symptoms are not random, that the crisis is not catastrophe but opportunity, that what feels like death is actually birth. This is the fourth principle of transformation. The ego must die before the self can be born, not physical death, not the cessation of consciousness, but the death of identification with the small self, the wounded self, the self that believes it is separate, alone, fundamentally flawed. And this death feels like annihilation. It feels like everything we have built, everything we have believed, everything we are, is crumbling. Because it is. But what is crumbling is not the truth of who we are. It is the story we have told about who we are. And that story, however painful, has been home. It has been identity. It has been the only self we have known. Releasing it is grief. Deep, profound, existential grief. And this grief must be honored. It cannot be rushed. We must mourn the loss of the familiar, even when the familiar has been suffering. We must say goodbye to the wounded identity, even as we welcome the possibility of wholeness. This is the work of therapy at its deepest level, not problem solving, not symptom reduction, but witnessing the death and rebirth of the self. And it cannot be done alone. It requires the presence of another, a therapist, a guide, a community who can hold space for the dissolution without trying to fix it, who can remain steady while we fall apart, who can see our wholeness even when we cannot. This is what the attachment researcher John Bowlby meant when he said healing happens in relationship. The original wound occurred in relationship, through abandonment, betrayal, violation, and healing must occur in relationship, through attunement, consistency, repair. But not just any relationship. A relationship characterized by what the psychologist Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard. A relationship where we can be fully seen, including our shadow, including our shame, including our wound, and still be accepted. This experience of being held in our totality, of being witnessed without judgment, of being met in our vulnerability, this is reparative, this is corrective. This begins to rewrite the original encoding that we are unworthy, unlovable, fundamentally flawed, But here is the paradox. We cannot seek this healing relationship from the wounded place. The wound attracts what is familiar, what confirms its narrative. The wounded self seeks other wounded selves and calls it love. True healing relationship can only be received when we have begun to heal ourselves, when we have done the inner work of witnessing our own shadow, of meeting our own wound with compassion, of becoming the loving presence for ourselves that we once needed from others. This is the fifth principle of transformation. We must become our own healer before we can fully receive healing from another. This does not mean we heal alone. It means we must develop what D.W. Winnicott called the capacity to be alone in the presence of another, the ability to be with ourselves, to soothe ourselves, to regulate ourselves while remaining open to connection. This capacity develops through what trauma therapists call pendulation, the oscillation between activation and settling, between being in the wound and being in the present, between contraction and expansion. We cannot stay in the wound constantly without re-traumatization, but we also cannot avoid it without repression. Healing happens in the rhythm, in the movement between remembering and returning, between feeling and grounding, between opening and integrating. This is why healing is not linear, why we do not simply get over trauma and move on, why we may need to visit the wound many times, each time at a deeper level, each time integrating more, until eventually the wound is no longer a wound but a scar, evidence of what we survived, but no longer an open, bleeding place. And even then, the scar may be tender. Certain situations may activate old patterns, but the difference is we recognize them. We have choice. We are no longer compulsively driven by the unconscious imperative to recreate the wound. This is freedom, not the absence of pain, not the permanent elimination of all suffering, but the presence of choice, the capacity to respond rather than react, the ability to see the pattern without being consumed by it. And in this freedom, something new becomes possible. We can finally ask not, why did this happen to me? But what wants to be born through this? Because every wound carries a gift. Every crisis conceals an opportunity. Every breakdown invites a breakthrough. The gift is not the trauma itself. Let us be clear. Suffering is not good. Abuse is not justified. Trauma is not desirable. But our response to suffering, our willingness to face it, to integrate it, to transform it, this is where meaning is made. This is where resilience is forged. This is where consciousness evolves. And here, finally, we arrive at the deepest truth of our exploration tonight. We fall in love with our wounds, not because we are broken, but because we are attempting to become whole. The repetition compulsion is not self-destruction. It is the psyche's attempt at self-healing. Every time we return to the wound, we are unconsciously hoping that this time will be different, that this time we will master it, resolve it, transform it. The problem is not the attempt. The problem is the method. We are trying to heal the wound by recreating it, rather than by facing it directly. But when we understand this, when we see that our apparently self-defeating patterns are actually attempts at self-healing, everything changes. The saboteur becomes the protector. The symptom becomes the message. The wound becomes the teacher. And the love we feel for our suffering reveals itself as the soul's fierce commitment to its own evolution. This reframe is not semantic game-playing. It is a fundamental shift in how we relate to our experience, from adversarial to collaborative, from victim to participant, from passive sufferer to active creator of meaning. And in this shift, the wound begins to release its hold, not because we have defeated it, but because we have finally understood what it has been trying to tell us all along. You are not your wound, but you are not separate from it either. You are the consciousness that can witness the wound, hold the wound, and ultimately transcend the identification with the wound while honoring its place in your becoming. So here we are, at the end of our descent, having traveled through the origins of psychological wounding, the machinery of self-sabotage, and the alchemy of transformation. What have we learned? We have learned that the wounds we carry are not simply scars from the past, but active structures in the present, organizing our perception, shaping our choices, defining our identity. We have learned that we fall in love with our wounds because they provide meaning, coherence, protection, and purpose in a chaotic universe. We have learned that healing is not elimination, but integration, not transcending the wound, but understanding it so deeply that it transforms from prison into portal. And we have learned that transformation requires courage we did not know we possessed, the courage to descend into darkness, to face our shadow, to surrender our familiar identity, to die and be reborn. But learning is not enough. Understanding is not transformation. We must now ask, what do we do with this knowledge? The answer is both simple and impossibly difficult. We must begin the work of witnessing our patterns without judgment, the work of feeling what we have spent a lifetime avoiding, the work of developing compassionate presence with our own experience, the work of asking not, what's wrong with me, but what happened to me, and how can I respond with wisdom rather than reaction. This work cannot be done once and considered complete. It is the work of a lifetime, because new layers of the wound reveal themselves as we develop capacity to meet them, because healing is not a destination, but a process, because becoming whole is not a state we achieve, but a practice we engage in, moment by moment, choice by choice. And this work, while it must be done by each of us individually, cannot be done in isolation. We need witnesses, we need companions, we need communities of practice where vulnerability is honored, where shadow is welcomed, where transformation is supported. We need, in other words, a culture that understands mental health is not the absence of struggle, but the capacity to be with struggle. Wellness is not the elimination of pain, but the integration of pain into a larger understanding of what it means to be human, because pain is not the problem. Suffering is not the enemy. The wound is not the tragedy. The tragedy is when we remain unconscious, when we live out our patterns without awareness, when we hurt others from our unhealed places, when we pass our wounds to the next generation without witnessing them, without taking responsibility for them, without transforming them. But this tragedy is not inevitable. It is a choice, and in every moment we have the opportunity to choose differently, to choose consciousness over unconsciousness, to choose integration over fragmentation, to choose compassion over judgment, to choose presence over avoidance, to choose becoming over remaining. This is the invitation that our wounds extend to us if we have the courage to listen. Your wound is not asking you to worship it forever. It is asking you to understand it fully so that you can release it completely. Your suffering is not asking you to identify with it permanently. It is asking you to extract its wisdom so that you can serve others who still struggle. Your shadow is not asking you to fear it eternally. It is asking you to integrate it so that you can become whole. And your broken places, those places you thought defined you, limited you, made you fundamentally flawed, those places are precisely where the light gets in, where grace enters, where transformation becomes possible. Because you are not your wound, but you are not separate from your wound either. You are the vast consciousness that can hold both the wound and the wholeness, both the pain and the possibility, both the past and the potential. You are the space in which healing happens, the awareness that witnesses transformation, the love that holds all of it, the darkness and the light, the suffering and the awakening, the dying and the being born. And this love, this fundamental yes to all of existence, this radical acceptance of what is while working toward what could be, this is not something you must achieve or earn or become worthy of. It is what you already are, beneath the wound, beneath the story, beneath all the layers of identification and defense and adaptation. You are at your deepest core already whole, already complete, already enough. The wound has been lying to you. It has convinced you that you are broken, that you are insufficient, that you need to be fixed before you can fully live. But that is not true. It has never been true. The wound was a response to impossible circumstances, a brilliant, creative, life-saving adaptation, and it served you well. It got you here. It kept you alive. But it is not who you are, and it does not have to define who you become. You can thank it for its service. You can honor it for its protection. You can even continue to feel tender toward the vulnerable place where it lives, but you do not have to be in love with it anymore. You do not have to organize your life around it. You do not have to let it be the lens through which you see all of reality. You can, if you choose, begin to see yourself through a different lens, a lens of possibility rather than limitation, a lens of wholeness rather than brokenness, a lens of becoming rather than being stuck. This is not spiritual bypassing. This is not positive thinking. This is not denying the reality of pain. This is the most radical act of all, choosing to see the truth that lies beneath the wound, the truth that you are vast, mysterious, endlessly creative consciousness, that you contain multitudes, that you are both the wound and the healing, both the question and the answer, both the darkness and the light. And from this truth, from this ground of being that transcends all our stories about ourselves, genuine transformation becomes possible, not because we have fixed ourselves, but because we have remembered what we always were. So tonight, as you leave this exploration, I ask you to sit with one final question. What would change if you stopped falling in love with your wound and started falling in love with your capacity to transform it? What would become possible if you released the identity of the wounded one and stepped into the identity of the consciousness that witnesses, holds, and ultimately transcends all wounds? What life wants to be lived through you, if you would only stop clutching the familiar suffering and open your hands to receive what is trying to emerge? These are not rhetorical questions. They are invitations, portals, beginnings, and the answer to them will not come through thinking. It will come through feeling, through embodiment, through the slow, patient, courageous work of meeting yourself exactly where you are, with exactly what you have, and choosing, moment by moment, to move toward wholeness rather than remaining in fragmentation. This is the journey. This is the work. This is the path that every wound points toward, if we have the eyes to see and the heart to follow. May you find the courage to descend. May you find the patience to witness. May you find the compassion to hold all of it, the pain and the possibility, the wound and the wholeness. May you discover that you are, and have always been, so much more than your suffering, and may you fall in love not with your wound, but with the vast, mysterious, beautiful consciousness that you are, the consciousness that has survived everything, that contains everything, that is capable of transforming everything. This is your birthright. This is your truth. This is your invitation to awakening. The descent is complete. The ascent begins now. Thank you for having the courage to take this journey with me tonight. Until we meet again in the next exploration of consciousness, remember, you are not broken. You are breaking open, and that changes everything.